Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca. I am a ichthyologist but also a PhD student studying the evolution of Loricariidae, which is plecos, and looking at their morphology related to their diet particularly. So today's topic, I'm going to talk about how reproductive biology related to fishes really affects how we should think about breeding fishes and implications on maybe fertility and general just how breeding works in a way. So maybe to most mammals, reproduction seems simple, easy, just basic, but even there it's more complex than it seems. It's not entirely well understood, and century-long myths are still spread about the processes, even within animal care. Firstly, reproduction does involve two very important processes, but there's many other processes involved with the whole the whole thing. For males, there's the production of sperm, and for those that aren't aware, sperm is the cell or the gamete that is produced by the males or individuals with testes and ovotestes, because in fishes, hermaphrodites aren't rare, they're just not the most common. And traditionally, these contain half of the genetic information of the embryo. Of course, in reality, this can be a little bit more complex. So the production of these cells is known as spermatogenesis. This is the process where sperm is produced from a more basic cell state. And this is constant, and sperm is produced throughout the individual's lifespan. Production can be hindered by the environment or biological factors, temporarily or permanently. This would depend on what is causing the disruption, when, how much. For example, at least in mammals, temperature plays a massive role in sperm production too high, and the number reduces of sperm, but I'd assume also temperature might also play a role in fishes' sperm production or the mortality of these cells. Diet is also important, and these can reduce the number of sperm or cause abnormalities. So when thinking about what you're feeding your fish, sometimes a diet might look good in the short term, especially if you're breeding. You've got to think there might be a diet for breeding, and then the fish will want to change and be more about maybe building up its own mass rather than building up sort of reproductive sort of focusing on reproduction. So maybe looking at a diet that maybe is more, or switching up the diet maybe seasonally, might be a really good idea to sort of help with breeding, because a lot of people do find that individuals do seem to sort of run out of steam. They're not producing as much sperm, or maybe the sperm's not as successful over time. And so really think about diet in other ways. A diet might be great for getting the fish to breed, but it might not be great for the fish's well-being, the fish's health. So then the fish will likely be focusing on that rather than breeding, if you get what I mean. It's not most easiest thing to explain in a way. Males, unlike females, as this is a constant process, do not seem to run out of sperm, but production might decrease, or the quality will decrease over age eventually. So maybe more abnormalities will appear, which is also something you do see in females as they reach the end of their reproductive life. A male fish shouldn't live long past this process, past the point it's highly productive. So when you see that people say there's no point keeping, say Hypancistria zebra is a big one, past 5 years for breeding because they're not fertile anymore, this really hints that there's maybe an actual problem with the fish's diet, the environment, maybe even the fish itself. Maybe there's some actual issue with where it's who's breeding it. So it might be a congenital issue, but a fish shouldn't be infertile that early, especially males shouldn't be, like, because that makes it like half of its lifespan, not even half, quarter of its lifespan is the only time it's reproductive, and even less than that, because if you think that fish has to reach about 3 years old to be reproductive, 2, 3, and then it needs and then it's infertile after 5 or 7, which really doesn't make sense. And there are people that actually do breed their fishes way past that age, and you shouldn't have a massive disparity, like say most aren't reproductive after 5 years, and then like some are reproductive even into their 20s. So it's a really interesting topic, and maybe looking at diet, I think, is the main key, and think about diet as not something that you have this one stable diet. Maybe think about how you can change it with variety depending on seasons, because this is what they'd experience in the wild. Fish probably won't, not many fish are probably reproducing for that whole yearly span. Some of that time will be putting onto their own health rather than onto reproductive health or onto brood care. So generally not thinking about it as that they've got to keep pumping it out. So the other one is females. Egg production and oogenesis. Eggs are gametes, so cells, reproductive cells, but produced by females, individuals with ovaries and ovotestes. Because fish reproduction is complicated, ovotestes exist, and also there's always a bit of complication. Even with testes, which is the male reproductive organ, females can produce testes. If you use certain hormones, you can induce the development of testes in, I've seen it done in trout. So they will be genetically, and you could say biologically female, but they've got testes. Their offspring will all be female, because from my understanding these fish have the same sort of sex determination as humans, so XY, XX. So that female, even if it's got testes, it's not going to suddenly produce a Y chromosome. It's going to keep pushing out females, which is why it's quite useful if you want, in farming, if you only want the females, you could do something like that. Obviously it's not going to work with probably mammals, otherwise they would have done it already. For example, cattle, but with trout, I think it was trout, might have been salmon, I've seen it done. So egg production and oogenesis. Eggs contain half of the genetic information, and when I'm talking about genetic information, I'm really just talking about that nuclear DNA, because then it gets a bit more complicated. So they contain half the genetic information for that embryo. Previously in the past, I think even like Aristotle put a very low role on the female's contribution, but we do know that females obviously now give half of that genetic information, or somewhat half and somewhat the male. It's very, very complicated, because I'd assume that there's always going to be, it's never going to be 50-50. And then there's the other part. So most of the mitochondrial information, and there probably are exceptions I think, is inherited down the female line, and you might have heard of this. So mitochondria are the organelles that produce energy for the cell. They have their own genetic code. So when you're looking at phylogenetics, or you might be looking at other things related to genetics, or even you might be looking at your own family tree and you want to look down your mother's line, you might be looking at the mitochondrial DNA, because that is generally inherited through the female line. You won't really have it information from the male line, and that does create its own issues when it comes to phylogenetics, because obviously it can infer its own family tree. In the sort of species general level, I wouldn't say it would at the family level before people start freaking out or anything. But it has its own genetic code. This generally runs down the maternal line, so the female line. And hence diseases based on energy production particularly tend to run down that female line, and you can get mitochondrial donors, I believe. So that can be a little bit more complicated when we look at it. Obviously it depends on the disease when it comes to that sort of thing. But egg production is maybe a little bit less understood in a way. Egg production starts, like with mammals, I assume, when the fish is still an embryo, continuing while it's larval and mature. Each stage, the eggs aren't all fully mature once the fish hatches. Each stage is it progresses throughout that fish's sort of development till it reaches sexual maturity, and then I'd assume each egg would reach its final stage of maturity when it's produced ready for fertilization. And I believe the final stage might be at fertilization, but I might be wrong because I haven't studied that in a long time, and fish might work a little bit differently. But the total number of eggs will be limited from the start of when that fish is developing those eggs, so when the fish is an embryo. So that's a lot like mammals, and therefore there will be no more production after this development. So unlike males, fish, females, or those with ovaries, those producing eggs, those eggs will run out eventually. And it's not like that you can say like, oh, I'll prevent this fish from breeding now, so we'll save the eggs for later for when we get a better male or something like that. It's a lot more complicated than that, and I think with seasons it makes it even worse to understand. But then you could compare obviously to mammals, which might have seasons, but there is this sort of a cycle, whether it takes longer or shorter. So the total number of eggs is limited. What does happen is that the eggs mature at different rates, so they are constantly producing these gametes, these cells, like males, or constantly developing them rather than constantly producing. And there's a set amount that tend to mature over time, and this might increase with age though. As an individual gets older, it might start producing more eggs, and then that will decrease, so it kind of peaks a little bit. But it does mean that eggs will run out. The amount that mature in a set time would be influenced by the environment, the biology, therefore age. I'd assume the volume is low before peaking at a certain time, then reducing again. But does this affect how we breed fishes? I think it should. I think we should also look at how we are keeping fishes. The next aspect of this is a misconception, and you'll see it said all the time. So it's common that many people will say something along the lines of, my fish are happy because they are breeding. So this is a really complex topic on why animals breed, what triggers them to breed, when they breed, how they breed, sort of amount, fertility, fecundity, all of those words, terms. It's an interesting one with many different theories and studies, and there are many different reproductive strategies, and I would say for most of the fish we keep, we don't really know entirely what they fall under. Here are two sort of aspects, or no animal's really going to fall under one entirely, but these are two sort of methods. So one's called seminal parity. This is a single reproductive event, likely in large numbers with little energetic expense towards the offspring development. So you're not, there's no brood care at all. And you could say ones that really suit this might be the killiefishes. The annual killiefishes, rather than the ones that might go on. And then the other method is iteroparity, which is multiple reproductive events over the animal's lifespan, but they're energetically costly and in short numbers. Energetically costly, maybe there's brood care involved. So there's quite a few that we can think of that are involved in that. And there's several different methods. So we've got cichlids and even Loricariidae for brood care. They're looking after that offspring while it's developing, while it's hatching, and giving it sort of, well, putting a lot of energy into developing this offspring and allowing it to get bigger, prevent it from predation. But they're producing very small numbers in comparison to ones that, say, broadcast spawners, and they're just like, I think sturgeon are an example where they just throw or even danio, tetra, they're just eggs everywhere and they're off. Another one might be live bearers. So a lot of people will think, oh, guppies, platies, swordtails, even the stingray. I don't know if stingray have any brood care afters, but they put very little energetic expense into offspring. But that's completely untrue. Live bearers of any kind, whether it's viviparous or ovoviviparous, they put a lot of cost into allowing that embryo to develop within them. Whether it's developing as an egg, is costly, and then they've got to, well, they've got to fit it in the first place, and then they've got to kind of produce it out, give birth. So that's all costly and dangerous at the same time compared to just dumping eggs. And it probably leaves you at a higher chance of predation as you're larger, you're slower. Predators are going to be able to see you and be like, yeah, that one is a little bit weaker. And also, you're spending time and energy on just developing that offspring, and when you could be putting it into your own growth, your own health. So it's costly in its own way, but there's many different methods, because you could also say that they do it in the sort of, the females don't seem to live as long, but that's another aspect of reproduction. Not all animals follow these two methods, and they might only follow aspects of it. As I said, the danios, the tetras, they're dumping their offspring, but it's not one single event. They're constantly doing it, constantly, like, there will be triggers, but they are doing it throughout their lifespan, but they're putting very little effort in. And in general, it's a balance between the cost of reproduction and the cost of against it and holding it off. Each species chooses its own, or not at all in a way. Reproduction can occur more frequently even in times of stress, when adults are less likely to survive, but perhaps the juveniles are likely to. So annual killifish is probably the most extreme, because they produce those eggs. Those eggs are going to survive being desiccated, so that drying up period when the adults won't be. So they're breeding to get the juveniles surviving where the adults wouldn't do. Maybe it's a method of increasing your numbers. So potentially, if there's a predator, maybe they're breeding in large numbers to deter the predator, rather than, or like, so that some of those babies will get eaten, but then as a population, they're doing better off. There's so many different methods, so many different ideas, and you can almost hypothesize different breeding methods. Seasonal breeding methods, stress can be a trigger as well, but whether it's good or bad, sometimes it's always difficult to even suggest or know whether it is good or bad. So maybe the temperature suddenly dropping, and that can trigger ones, but that could be because there's a deluge of water, there's more nutrients, there's more food coming in, so my offspring can survive better, or more of us can survive, so we're going to breed then, so that offspring is going to develop off the incoming food resources. But it really just depends on the fish, and we shouldn't rely on the fact that the fish is breeding, that it means that it's happy and not stressed. But then is stress bad? Stress is good and bad, and it depends on the type of stress. So individuals might hold off on reproduction until times where offspring are more likely to survive. Another related point is cannibalism of offspring to put parents at their advantage. I think all of these you can research further or look into. It's completely wrong in general that a species will reproduce when it's more happy. It just really depends on the species, and happiness can't really be judged in animals entirely. Maybe it has to do with the amount of offspring. Costly offspring are best refrained from sometimes, and so those that require care in times of stress, you might want to reduce that costly offspring, ones that require energetic cost. But then sometimes it might be worth it because they might be more likely to survive. Where you could put a lot of offspring in times of stress, it's likely a better idea if some might survive. So what does this mean? Offspring, reproduction is a little bit more complicated and requires thought. If a fish isn't breeding, well, there could be more to it than simply you haven't met that seasonal requirement, or that you might not have met some other requirement. Then diet is a massive one. If a fish stops breeding, it could be due to something affecting their biological functions, or maybe time. The fish might not be old enough in the first place, which is a common one. People will ask, oh, how do I breed my fish? And it's like, they're adults like that big, and that's like that big. It's not, cichlids will, but not all fish will, and not many fish probably will. And looking into stuff like diet, temperature, and also maybe even tank mates, whether they're stressed, whether they feel that there's a predator around, can really influence behaviour. So if you have loads of small fish and then you got a big fish, maybe they don't even have to predate on each other. That will influence behaviour, or can influence behaviour. So the final part of this video I'm going to talk about is fertilization. This is the process that the sperm embeds itself into the egg and then shares its genetic information. Technically, yeah, there'd be another word for that, to embedding itself. But there's more to this, and I'll cover some basics when it comes to fish breeding. The sperm must be compatible with the membrane of the egg. So there's many factors that will influence whether it's compatible or not. How might it not be compatible though? Abnormalities, so maybe that's influenced by environment, age, some issue with the fish itself, some congenital issue, it could be just environment itself. So that can influence, because the sperm is a cell and it can get abnormalities. If it is abnormal, it probably won't fertilise the egg or even be allowed access. Different species might have different sperm morphology, so it might not even be able to access the egg at all. And also later on, where there's likely a difference in chromosomal number, this will have a larger effect whether the embryo will be, the egg will be fertilised, and whether it will affect later on, because it might be fertilised but it might not be compatible to develop further or past a certain stage. Further selection might go through development against that offspring if it is another species or if it's a different genus. Hybridisation is not defined by that species definition rules. And then there'll be other factors. So I've covered this topic a little bit now. If anyone has any questions, ask in the comments. I kind of want to do a video in time on inheritance, or sex determination would be the word. And in fishes it's a lot more complicated. And a lot of people don't understand the difference between maybe inheritance of sex, the sex determination, and maybe sex influenced mortality is probably the best word, or mortality against a particular sex, because you see that across the animal kingdom, that one sex has a higher mortality than another for a variety of reasons. It doesn't have to be behavioural, it could be environmental, because there will be slight biological differences. But anyway, thank you for watching. If you like my videos, please comment, like, subscribe, and goodbye.